Hey, just a quick video to run through how the project's set up for this. Just quickly show you gameplay. So there's a scene called play game, which does what it says. Um, it's a pretty simple setup. We've got ball controller, and you can turn on logging or not if you want. There's tons of logging because it's just so you can see how it actually plays. Um, Various other options. The agent's trained so that player X takes a turn on the random turn. Well, it does like 40% random, 60% optimum, is how I trained it. So if you want to train it differently, you can. If you turn that off, you'll get like suboptimal performance from X because that's just how it's trained. Um, and they're both trained fairly well. I'll show you. You still get the odd thing where you think, oh, perhaps it could have done better. Um, I think if I was going to do this for real, I'd probably have sort of, I don't know, 10 or 20 perhaps trained brains on different seeds that I sort of randomly picked a brain as well as the as well as this to stop you sort of finding one solution that worked that it couldn't deal with. But it's pretty good. You have to actually think about it most of the time now. Just quickly show you. So if you want to, so at the moment if you press start now it won't load. It'll just play yourself, which is still quite good because you can just step through and then look at all this logging. Just press reset if you want to change. If you want to play against X, you can play like this. But yeah, you do actually have to think a bit now. So that works quite well. One of the big things I struggled with was like you have to be careful you don't anticipate so like check. Yeah, see that made a suboptimal move there. But what was happening was like it would be like this as a human you want to go here, so I'd go here and then it wouldn't. But that's all sort of fixed now. Like it's not going to win every time, but it certainly gives you a run for your money most of the time. And as I say, I think I just do it with different seeds. Player 2 was the hardest one to train. Now I've got it working, it works well. But trying to get to do stuff like that to stop you doing the sort of classic in the corner. Took me a while to figure that out. But yeah, it's pretty good now and again. You want to just check every now and then that it does actually like win, but it's pretty cool. So I'm pretty pleased with that. And there's tons of logging in here, but that's on purpose so that you can actually see how the flow works. And then there's a separate seed in here called train both. So this is what you can use to build. It's got no pieces in it because you don't need them for the training. You can turn them on if you want. So in the ball controller, I've just got hide pieces turned on because there's no point. Random first term, so you can turn that off if you want to train it. Without, then neither of these have got a brain in. So I've got team ID set up 1 and 2 because I'm doing it as team-based training. You can do like just PPO and bash them against each other, which does sort of work. But the way I'd set this up, which I think I'd do differently if I did it again, was I've done it sort of strictly turn-based. So like the first player does its observations, then the second one does its observations. So in this game, the second player is always going to have one less move in its episode. So then if you try and train them against each other, it sort of gets out of sync if you just do it with PPO. And then at the end, it all just, it gets a bit crazy. So I think if I did it again, I'd probably do it so like all of the players took an observation every turn. So they always took the same amount of steps. But it works great for if you use the team-based self-play because that's what it's designed for. And you can also tweak it so like player 0 if you wanted did more training than 1 and it all just works. The issue which I mentioned in the documentation that there is a little bug with the self-play which I've reported. But what happens is when you get down to, actually I can probably show you in an old run. Let's see if I've got one. So this is one run that I've run earlier. So just when you go into the logs, it'll put down a log for each environment. So I did this headless. And it will dump if there's an error. So this stuff here is just normal sort of Unity stuff. That just is what it is. Um, so what you'll see is, so the first here is the Academy step, and then this is the fixed update step, and you can see they're linked. And what happens is, it's if you restart, or if you um, change when you change players, you can see what happens here is it goes like 1, 2, 3, and then it resets the Academy step when it changes. And at the point where it does that, it forces an episode begin, even though it's at the right mask stage. And then that forces it to basically pass a null, as far as I can see, which gets interpreted as a 0. So it passes you through an action that's a 0, which can really mess you up if you're doing the turn-based stuff. And it's really predictable. So that's where it started. And then, yeah, you can see it's basically every time it swaps. So I mean, it looks like there's loads here, but this is just dumping the whole session with all the verbose logging. Yeah, so it went down and it got a 0 there. So I'll just reset. So all I do is, like, if I get a 0, I keep 0 masked all the time, and if I get it, I just reset the game. I'll show you that in the code in a sec. It's really stable. Yeah, it's just a little glitch, and I think what happens is, if you're not doing turn-based, there's so much of it just gets lost in the overall noise of everything going on. It doesn't really matter. But because we're working with so few samples, it's like really obvious what it's doing. So it's just something to be aware of. As I said, the workaround is I've used this to yeah, just to mask it, keep it masked all the time, and then I know that if it does come through as an issue, I've included like a setup file as well for doing the self-training. These seem to work well. Anything over sort of 450,000 looks like it starts to overfit and it starts to bounce around a bit. This could probably tune more. I found anything under 128 didn't converge properly. And also, when you look at the tensor board, it's never going to go down to 0. One, because I've got the beta high, because I'm making it change, and the learning constant. So it's always sort of like trying a few bits anyway. And it's just where it bounces back between each other. So I put lots of comment. I won't go through this, otherwise it'll be here for hours. But it's basically small batch size, high epoch count, because we've got a very small amount of detail. So I'm just trying to maximise the sort of usage of it. Gamma sort of pushed back as early on in the process as we want, because it's a very short session and we've got immediate rewards. Yeah, the rest is just around how often you want to do the training. But I'm sure there's better configuration, but this works well. So you can start from here and then tweak it if you want to play. And then there's a batch file as well, which all it does is just basically check if there's any executables running, just in case, like, you killed the session, they didn't die. Yeah, and then it just runs it. But this is quite cool as well, because you can, like, obviously just stack these if you've got a bunch of different files you want to try out, without going crazy with some, optuner or whatever. You can put down sort of 10 or so and just let it chug away through them, and just have a look at how it went in TensorBoard afterwards, just as a sort of simple way to do it. So they're all in under config, and there's just a little helper thing here for firing up TensorBoard, so I don't have to keep remembering what to type. Yeah, and I've got everything running in a Conda environment, which is in the notes. I think it's definitely worth doing that, and just paying attention to what Python levels and things, otherwise it can be a bit flaky. So let's have a quick look at the code. So it's a really basic project. So these are the codes. I'll put the rewards as a scriptable object, so you can mess around with these. So these two here, you can set it up so you can give it like a small negative reward if you want, if it missed a win or a block, which I didn't really think I should have to do. And as it turns out, once I got the observations right, I didn't. But it's interesting to see the effect on that, because it's not always what you think. And then I've kept this as simple as possible, because it should converge at 0, because that's all it can do if it's playing perfectly, and it does now. But originally I was messing about with all sorts of different things, really, where I got the observation space set up wrong. So I'll run through the observations. No, I'll start from the beginning. So the board's the main controller. So let me just show you that. I haven't committed it yet, so I'll commit this in a sec. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's basically running a loop on fixed update. Where are we here? Because that keeps in sync with Academy, and I've put loads of comments in here. There's something to think about if we were to do it for real, because obviously you can sort of spam click this, because when you're capturing the human input, when doing human interaction, you're really capturing an update which runs faster than fixed update. So that's something to consider. I think, well, I'm certainly going to think about when I do like a real game using it, because you really want a separate training environment, and then run it on update in a separate sort of stream, I think. And what this is doing, and I couldn't think of a better way to do this, so I'd be interested if anybody's got a better way to do it. It's just looping through. So the big challenge I found is the request decision piece, because request decision is non-blocking. So this is calling the decision on the agent. But all that does is register the agent to say like, hey, I'm ready to make a decision. And then in the background, Academy ticks along. And then so the next tick, Academy go, is there anything that wants to make a decision? Oh yeah, I'll make the decision. Which means if you're doing it as turn-based, as soon as you call that, your code just keeps running. So there's basically a lot of loops here that are saying, is it ready? Is it ready? Which may or may not be the best way to do this, but it's been pretty solid. For training, for example, here I've got like a little timeout thing, which I haven't actually hit yet, but I'm sure at some point I will. So that if it does get stuck in a loop, it resets everything. Not that that's happened as yet. And then the key thing here, which is around where that little sort of turn bug piece was, where it flips the player when training, I'm really making sure that each of the agents, it's making sure that they're basically in a state to go before it starts. So it absolutely won't start until both agents are ready. And when they reset it, make sure they're both being picked up and they're ready. So as soon as I put this in and sort of locked it down a lot, then the training got really stable. Because I think what was happening was everything was just getting a bit out of sync, and then it just gets worse as you go through the training. So you have to be really careful how that actually works with the turn-based. And like I said, if I did it again, I think I'd do it so every agent took an observation every time there was a player made a move. The other thing that was key was basically you've got to take an observation, make the move, then take another observation, then move on to the next player. Otherwise, you don't get like the full flow of events, and it can't train properly because it sort of skips one if you do it like that. And I could only work out how to get an observation on an action or a decision. I'll show you that in a sec when we look at the agent. But yeah, so all this does is really it's just a whole bunch of loops saying like, am I ready to move? Yes. Make the move. Has Academy done the decision? Yes. Do I need to change player? What's the status? Do I need to finish? And then if it finishes, it makes the request on both of them, and finishes it off. And that's all there is to it really. The rest of this is just around the rewards, and as you saw, I'd abstracted those a bit with that scriptable object. I think that's about it really. And then really it's just like, working out what available moves, placing pieces, just basic game logic. There's nothing in there of any note really, and probably a lot of ways to do it better, but it is what it is. And then the agents, I'm using the same agent for both, but I'm training them separately because of the way I've got it set up. So I just found that easier because like player two's got one less step in the one less turn, and it's very much playing defensive, whereas player one you're sort of playing to win all the time. So I just train them separately. So one of the things I've done here is I've put a custom vector sensor in there. Not that I needed to, but basically because I couldn't find any good documentation on how to do it, and I figured that was something I was going to want to be able to do, is put custom sensors in, especially to do more complicated board games where I think we're going to have to stack it and treat it more like an image than a vector space. So if you look at all of these, they've got like a separate vector sensor. So the internal one is set as 0. So we're not using that, although that would have worked fine in this case. I just wanted to work out how to do this. And then there's a custom sensor. So all I've done is there's an internal vector sensor, So I just copied that and then just messed about with it a bit so it worked outside of the context of the mlagents piece. This is quite a good one to do, and this also lets you do like goal-based goal signal stuff, which we're not doing. We don't need it. And you could build on this, and it's just I think it's quite a good template once you worked out how to do it. So yeah, it wasn't that obvious, and the bit that really caught me out was if I show you. So the way it seems to work is you have the vector sensor component, which is what you just saw on the screen, and then that's got a piece on it that basically lets you get the sensor. So it like where it creates a sensor and then you can get it. And then that just creates this, which again I copied as well and just tweaked a bit. So it's nice to do this though because you can obviously get your own debugging in here. I wrote a couple of little extension on it to get the rewards out, things like that. That's definitely worth the pain. And then to call it, which is what caught me out, was you just get the component like you would normally, and then essentially Academy will call. Where are we? Collect observations. You don't actually call this, so you're overriding this in the agent class. Um, if you call the get sensor outside of this, it doesn't seem to work properly. I need to look at that in a bit more detail. So even though we're not using, so this is the internal sensor, which we're just ignoring because we're not using it. And then this is where I'm flattening out the table. So I've basically got 18 observations. So one is 0 or 1 if it's x, the other is 0 or 1 if it's 0. And then really flattening out. That was the main issue I had because I was just doing it in a vector space of 9, and then having like 1 for x and 2 for 0, which as a human feels normal, but for training it really gets confused about. The worst thing is it almost works, so I spent way too long trying to get it to work. But it gets really confused about like it doesn't understand the concept of like a 1 is x, 2 is whatever. So if you do it like this, which is I think it's called hot encoding, one hot encoding, so it's literally 0 or 1, and then it's a lot simpler flattening out for it to understand. But yeah, the way to call it, which is a bit odd I think, is you have to keep calling get sensor every time. If you don't do that, then it doesn't really work properly. So I think what must be happening behind the scenes is that, because I just assumed I could get the component and then point this at the sensor and that would be it. But if you do that, it doesn't work properly. So I think behind the scenes, Academy must be sort of resetting that object. And so if you point it at the object in start, this is again, I need to look at this in more detail. But I think if you point it at start, then you basically lose a reference to it. You're pointing at an old object. So yeah, you have to call it in here. Yeah. So, and then this is just the extra bit that I did where you know it's print out the observations. But there's tons of it's well over commented. All the logging flows in order. So just as well, this is all set up in the sort of order that it runs. So start actually runs before initialize, and then you don't ever call initialize. That gets called by Academy, and then it just starts to go through. So on episode begin is every time you start a new episode. So if you end it or do a forced end, it starts this again. This is where I've just added this extra bit here just to make sure that I can check whether the agents are ready or not. Then it collects the observations, and then we're using action masking. Say me action masking. So this is essentially saying these are the moves you're allowed to do. So you could train it without this. You could just give it a negative reward and end the session every time it picked a wrong move. But I chose to go this route. Yeah, this is where I'm keeping like a 0 mask because of that bug. And then I've got like 1 to 9 is where the values are. And then 10 is essentially treated as no action because you need to have some sort of like request a decision or an action to get an observation as far as I can see. And because I want 2 in each turn, I was saying like, request a decision. So then it gets the observation, gets the decision, and then I need to go again and say, well, now because I want another observation before I move on to the next player. So this way I said I can mask it and say, okay, well if it's an observation turn, I'll mask it with a 10, and that's basically no action. So it takes that as an action, but then all it does is gets the observation. It seems to work really well. I'm not sure if that's exactly the right way to do it, but it does work. The other thing to keep in mind is that right discrete action mask only happens when you're doing like training. If you're doing heuristics, so i.e. the humans doing it, it will still call this, but it'll ignore everything that's in here. So it sort of if you don't know any better, you think it's working, but it's not. So you have to recreate what you're doing in here in heuristics, which is obviously slightly different because this is the human version. It's definitely worth spending the time to get heuristics working properly and be representative of what you're expecting the AI to do, because it just makes debugging a lot better, because then you can just slowly play against yourself and figure everything out. So that's all this is doing. Yeah, and then it falls through, and then eventually it gets down to this on action received. And this is where I've got some of this extra bits in that I'm not really using now, but I just left it in there because it's quite interesting to play with. And here we're saying, like, if it's between 1 and 9, then it's a move. Otherwise, it's just observation only, so I don't do anything. I'll just basically tell it to go to the next stage. And if there's anything else, that's some sort of error. So I basically reset it. And then to reset it, instead of calling episode end, I'm calling episode interrupted, which is essentially the same thing, but it just gets treated slightly differently. So it's saying like the agent's finished, but not through any fault of its own, which is absolutely fine for this. So it literally goes through to wherever it got that 0, and then just starts again. It probably won't have any rewards, but even if it does, that's fine as well, because it would have got to a point where it made sense to have the rewards. So yeah, just starts another training session and resets everything. I think that's about it really. There's just a couple of helper things. I've written this little logging class because it's just quite handy for debugging, because you obviously don't want tons of logs coming out, but for me it was like trying to get my head around how the steps worked, and especially when you're running it headless. I found it easier. So this really just, like, each time it runs an episode, it stores all the logs. Then if there's an error, it dumps all the logs. If not, it does nothing. And you can set it up, but you can set it up to do real time as well. It's just a little class, and there's just a few extra bits in here. The human player piece, there's nothing of any note really. It's just is what it is. Just runs off update, and it's just clicking. So you can obviously, this is one you can simulate the issue that you'd have with running the game off fixed update and this on update, because if you like spam click this, then you're going to get unexpected behavior because you're moving quicker than the agent's moving essentially. So that's something to keep in mind. Yeah, but I think that's it really. I think that's covered everything. Yeah, so there we go. So yeah, enjoy. So this is the one for training, and you can just do file, build, and then just stick it in wherever you want. I've got some other ones here that I was messing about with. But yeah, and hit build, and then when you're running it, you don't need to link to the executable. You just literally can just put the environment where the path is, and like how many you want. Yeah, and no graphics, because you don't need that up, and I've hidden that stuff anyway in here. Yeah, I think that's everything. So hey, hopefully this is of use to somebody, and yeah, I'd be interested to see if anybody can do anything with it or make it better. It'd be quite nice to have as a resource for everybody. But yeah, it trains and it works now, so that's kind of cool. So yeah, there you go.